It's good to see all of those who are here this morning. Thankful for Nathan for leading that song to kind of help prepare us for the lesson. Thank you to all those that are visiting with us. And if there's any advice I guess I could give you is don't give Steve personal information when he has the announcements. Yes, it has been a while since I have brought a lesson. I usually try to sign up for teaching because when you teach, if you get flustered, you can go to a verse or call on someone for a question. When you preach, you're just sitting there quietly looking at me. So there's no one coming to save me. But I am excited to bring the lesson to you this morning. And something I want to say, what makes it so exciting, makes it so easy is this group. This is the most encouraging group that we have here. And I know that from all the other guys who fill in, all the encouragement you give them to the guys who fill in. We appreciate that. It makes it so much easier when you know you're going to be up here and people are going to want to listen. They're going to have their Bibles open. And if we've studied from God's Word and we've prepared, that this group will be ready. So I appreciate your kind attention this morning. If you want to be open your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 6, that's going to be the framework of our lesson this morning, the kind of the latter part of Deuteronomy chapter 6. In our adult class in the back, we've been going through the Old Testament. For those of you, some of you have been back there. In the first part of this year, Brody and I had the privilege of teaching Numbers and Deuteronomy. And when we were getting ready for that class, I will say, adopted, not developed, because I'm pretty sure this is not an original idea that I have this morning, but what we developed was sort of a theme that how can we take what was going on with the Israelites as they were wandering through the wilderness? How does this apply to us as Christians? And there's so many things, so many lessons we can get from the account of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness that apply to us as Christians. And so what we adopted was this, which is also the kind of the framework of our lesson today, which is that Israel had escaped slavery. Okay, they were actually slaves in Egypt. They had escaped that. They had not yet made it to the promised land yet, to Canaan. So they were kind of in this in-between. They're in the wilderness. And while they're there, there's a lot of things going on. They're learning how to trust and obey God. Okay, they're learning how to move when He says to move. And so as Christians, we're sort of in that same situation. We are no longer slaves to sin. We are out of the bondage of sin. We haven't made it to the promised land yet. So we too are kind of in this in-between, trying to survive the wilderness of life, that you might say. And while we're here, we're trying to learn to trust. We're trying to learn how to obey God. And so what I would like for you to kind of lean on today, kind of an overall theme as we work through the lesson that you'll see, is that God has always been faithful to His people. You'll see that the same God who led Israel through the wilderness is the same God that's leading the church today. And so as Christians, we can confidently trust Him while we're traveling through life's wilderness. So before we get into our reading this morning, just a little bit of quick context, because if you're like me, it had been a long time since I had studied Deuteronomy, and there were things that I did not even realize that were in there. So there may be some of you who weren't in that class, or maybe some of the young kids, or if you're visiting with us, just to give you a really quick kind of context that will be important to our reading here in just a moment. So as we said, the Israelites have escaped slavery. They're now camped on the plains of Moab, a pretty desolate place. And this new generation is going to be ready to enter Canaan because the first generation was, because of their sins, are not going to be allowed to enter into the promised land. And so Moses isn't going to get to go into the promised land either. Deuteronomy chapter 6 is kind of this hallmark chapter. There's a lot of what's going on in Deuteronomy is reminding them, right? Because this second generation wasn't around for a lot of these things that happened, okay? They didn't see them. So there's a huge responsibility on parents to remind their children of the things they saw. And why Deuteronomy chapter 6 is also kind of this hallmark chapter is because of the Shema. And if you don't know what that is, I didn't either. If you'll look at verses 4 through 6, then you should recognize that hopefully pretty quickly. Very prominent passage. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord our God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And so the end of this chapter then, what comes at the conclusion, is what is going to be the text for our lesson this morning. So if you'll read with me, we'll start down here in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 20 through 25. When your son asks you in time to come, saying, what do the testimonies, the statutes, the judgments mean which the Lord our God commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And the Lord brought us up from Egypt with a mighty hand. Moreover, the Lord showed great and distressing signs and wonders before our eyes against Egypt, Pharaoh and all the household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land which he had sworn to our fathers. So the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, and for our survival as it is today. And it will be righteousness for us if we are careful to observe all the commandment before the Lord our God, just as he commanded us. So how do God's people survive the wilderness? Well, I think, as I said, there's a lot of examples we can pull out of how God dealt with the Israelites as they were wandering. And so I want to take some application from our reading this morning, and I have just 3 quick points this morning, and then the lesson will be yours. First of all, you have to remember God's deliverance. I'll warn you now that probably 2/3 of the lesson is going to deal with remembering, because that's a big part of this. So, verse 20 through 21 here, and really throughout a lot of Deuteronomy, there's a lot of parent-child imagery, which is, again, I think just when you're at different points in your life, you just read things differently probably as you get older. Maybe it's because the Israelites behaved like children a lot. There were a lot of complaining, a lot of rebelling, which sounds kind of like teenagers maybe. But like I said, why I think this resonated with me so much was just being at this point in my life of being a father. And if you turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 1, you see how God cared for them, just to get a little bit better idea. Deuteronomy 1:31. It says, "And in the wilderness where you saw how the Lord your God carried you, just as a man carries his son, in all the way which you have walked until you have came to this place." So you get all this parent-child imagery. You get that there's a big part of this is this generation that's not going to get to go in, of reminding their children, telling them, this is what we do, what we do. And so when your children come to you, there's going to be a point, it says in verse 20, that your kids are going to come and ask you, what does all this mean, right? And what I thought was so interesting to me is that the response caught me off guard, right? If you look at this reading, don't you think you could almost leave out 21 through 23? When your son comes to you asking, why we do all, what does all this mean? Verse 24, because the Lord commanded, it's for your good always, right? Very easily. Could have just went straight to that. And you think, do you answer your kids like that sometimes? Why can't we go here? Why do we have to do this? Why can't we wear this? Well, I said so. It's for your own good, right? Sometimes that's what we just want to say. Just listen to what I'm saying. But I think this would catch a child off guard instead of beginning with asking about why do we do all these things God has asked us to do. We were slaves, son. We were slaves to the Pharaoh of Egypt. And telling them in that sense that they were hopeless. They were absolutely destitute. They could not free themselves, and God is the one who saved them. Instructing them that redemption always begins with God. That's where it starts. And for us, you turn over to Romans chapter 6, and we talk about the correlation here. Romans chapter 6, verses 17 through 18. Romans 6, 17 through 18. "But thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, you became obedient from the heart to that form of teaching which you were committed, and having been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness." You notice the parallel here and also seeing God's consistency. So we too should remember God's deliverance. And when our kids or people of the world ask us, why do you guys do what you do? Why do you want to obey God? That it can start with, well, we once were slaves to sin. We could not save ourselves, but God, and through His mercy and through His Son, we're able to have salvation. The hard part, though, about remembering is that we tend to forget really quickly, right? That's the hard part. And I have a very vivid imagination, I feel like. I don't know if you guys do this, but even from a small age, I had a very vivid imagination. But I would think, man, if Noah was preaching, would I get on the ark? I would put myself there. And I would think a lot when we were reading this, man, I know I would be one of the ones complaining, just based off how I get when I'm hot and hungry. And it's absolutely, I probably would. So I like to imagine myself there, and I think, man, but I don't think I would forget the plagues, right? There's no way. You wouldn't have to tell me to tell my kids about that. Or seeing the chariots destroyed by the crossing of the Red Sea. There's no way you would forget that, right? But we forget. As humans, we forget very, very important things. Sadly, the analogy I was thinking of is kind of a sad one, so you just have to hang with me here. But I was thinking about 9/11. For those of you who are old enough, I remember where I was sitting as a sophomore in class, seeing that second plane hit the tower. But what was so impressed on me as a young man was seeing how the whole city came together. I don't know if you guys remember some of the news stories about that. People who traditionally hated each other were helping each other. It was like perfect brotherhood in the city, right? Across the U.S. it was like that. Patriotism, military recruitment was at an all-time high because of this tragedy. What did it look like a year later? Now, when we say they forget, we don't mean forget, right? There's still I've been to the museum, the 9/11 museum, very powerful. Nobody's forgot, but how important it is to us. The more removed we are from it, maybe we kind of lose the significance and we think, there's no way they would forget all these things that God did for them. But humans will forget. They need reminders. And so slowly we can go back to our old ways, forget about the deliverance that God gave each and every one of us. And we have to recognize that there is a challenge to remembering things. One other kind of quick thing I want to look at, maybe a little bit of a pivot here, but I think is important when we talk about practical things, just thinking about remembering, is we want to recall back to where we were, how God saved us, how He delivered us from being freed from sin. But when we look back on that previous life, do we romanticize about it a little bit? If we can get a little bit complainy like they did, right? That's what they would do. Did mom and dad tell the funny old stories about their college days and we kind of laugh? And I have probably done that. And I get it's to highlight how stupid we were right before we found Christ. But the Israelites, as soon as they would get a little hot and hungry, they would start to complain. Their memory would get distorted when they remember, right? What would they start to remember? Oh, we had watermelons and cucumbers and garlic. We had meat back in Egypt. They wanted to go back to being in slavery in difficult moments. And their memory gets distorted. They forget about the master's whips on their back and the fact they had no personal freedoms. But in those moments, we can get like that, right? We can just see what's right in front of us. We think we're in a bad situation. We might think, man, life was so much easier before I was a Christian. But never forget where God found you, what He saved you from, how He completely rescued you, and how much better your life is now being in Christ. Next, we have to remember His faithfulness, I think, is a big part of this too. And verse 22 and verse 23, we kind of talked about some of the signs and wonders that He performed on Egypt. We don't have time to get into all the plagues, but things that they were evident. They could see with their own eyes the things that God had done, these big, powerful things. And it's because of those things, again, that they should want to obey God. But I think to me what is really stands out here, if you go back to our reading, is in verse 23. I love those little simple but profound little statements in the Bible. It says in verse 23, He brought us out from there in order to bring us in. He was guiding them the whole time. He brought them out so He could save them. And something that was a really big epiphany kind of to me as we were in our class studying this was how I always had kind of viewed the idea of thinking about their wandering. Because Israel felt like they were wandering, no doubt. And I think from a human perspective, 40 years could seem like a lot of wasted time, right? Because when you and I think about wandering, what do you think about? I think about when we go to Bass Pro and we wander around, I'm not going to buy anything, but just meandering around. No purpose, right? We think just aimlessly wandering. I knew God was with them, but I had never really thought, well, they're just kind of stuck here. They're just wandering. There's no point to any of this. We already talked about Deuteronomy 1:31, where it says, God carried them like a man carries his small child. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 2. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 7. It says, "For the Lord your God has blessed you in all that you have done. He has known your wanderings through this great wilderness. These 40 years the Lord your God has been with you. You have lacked for nothing." You think about the fact that they had no crops, no stores, there was no economy, right? Yet they lacked for nothing while they were in a wilderness, and God was guiding them through all this. We think of wandering like there was no purpose to what they were doing. Again, to kind of further our point, turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 2. It says, "You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not." Notice, he wasn't just watching them. God was leading them while they were wandering. And they were exactly where he wanted them to be as he was preparing them for Canaan. It may not have always felt that way to them. And sometimes as Christians, we can feel like that, right? When we feel like, God's not doing anything in my life, like I'm just kind of have no purpose or direction, right? We can feel like we're aimlessly wandering. But God never promised that the Christian life was going to make sense always, right? But he did promise his presence. And turn over to your New Testaments in James chapter 1, verse 2-4, kind of similar for us as well as New Testament Christians. James 1, 2-4. It says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." The wilderness is what is producing endurance, right? For me, though, passages like this are hard for me, right? If you're kind of a complainer maybe, or a pessimist, right? When things get bad, we kind of think, oh, okay, I'll just be happy, right? I hadn't thought of that. And that's not a critique of this. This is absolutely what you should do. Because I can tell you the opposite of that is far worse. Getting down in the mud and just complaining when things are tough, thinking, oh, how terrible my life is. Everybody hates me. Does that make it any better? Does that prepare us for the next time? It definitely doesn't. I can tell you that from experience that it doesn't. Sometimes we mistake God's leading for aimless wandering because we just don't see the destination, right, is the main thing. How many times, and this is maybe some practical advice that has helped me, is when we go through trials and things that are difficult and we get out of those, and things didn't go the way we planned maybe, but they all worked out for the best, to go back and remember what all that felt like and how it all worked out. Sometimes we get out of the difficult situation, we just, oh, okay, I'm glad I'm done with that. We just move on with life. We don't thank God for... Instead of going back and thinking, hey, that was difficult, but everything worked out the way it should, even though it wasn't what I wanted. And if you're like me, you see pattern recognition for my ADD, ADHD people. It's preparing you for next time, right? You get in the hard, difficult situation, oh, I've been here before, right? This is going to be terrible, but I have been here before, and it's going to be okay. So looking back on those, reconnecting that how God saw you through those trials, that's what's producing the endurance, right? It's not always easy to be joyful in those situations, but the joy can be in knowing that it's going to work out, that God is in control of all of this. God promised. He told them that he would bring them out so he could bring them in. That's the whole story of redemption, isn't it? The same story that he has for us, that he brought us out of the death of sin in order that he might bring us into his eternal glory. In Romans chapter 15 and verse 4, there's so many passages I wanted to have in here that reference Israel's wandering and how that's for our learning and instruction, but one that's a little more condensed, Romans 15 and verse 4. For whatever is written in earlier times was written for our instruction, that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. This account of their wandering can give us hope. Even though things didn't always work out for them in the end perfectly, right? But what we need to see is that our confidence is not in ourselves. things may not always work out perfectly with humans' plans, right? We're seeing that now in our Joshua class. Right? They get to Canaan. Things go good for a while, but they start to fall apart quickly. That's not God's fault. His faithfulness is the same. But men can mess that up. We can let ourselves down. So our confidence is in God's faithfulness. The same God who led them through the wilderness is leading us today. And then one last thing I may tell you, we talk a lot about remembering, and I've thought a lot about remembering this here, especially this last week. And it's one thing to tell someone not to forget, right? Because I can tell myself not to forget something 1,000 times and still forget it. But it's another thing to give someone a way to remember, right? How are we working to remember? If you go back to our reading, I mentioned that there's this really famous, it's recited still today in the Jewish faith, the Shema. They recite this as like a prayer. But what comes after that, too, is very, very powerful, I think, too, in verses 6 through 9, when he tells them to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. Well, how do they do that? Let's read in verses 6 through 9, you see here in Deuteronomy chapter 6. It says, "These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your son, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." So Israel was to talk about God at home, right, on the road, when they went down to sleep, when they got up in the morning, all throughout the day. It wasn't just this part of their worship. They had very detailed ways to worship God too, right? But today, we set reminders, right? I think of all the ways that we remind ourselves to do things, and I was thinking about all the ones that I have. There's one every Tuesday night to take the trash cans up to the top. Just this Wednesday, guess what happened? I drove by my brother's house and saw his trash can. I was like, but the beauty of having kids now is, hey, have the girls take the trash cans up to that. I don't have to do the drive of shame to go back and get the trash cans anymore. But we set all kinds of reminders, right? We think, this is important, I want to remember this. And we don't consider that a weakness, right? If we think we have to remind ourselves constantly. We recognize our memory needs help, and I think God understood that long before smartphones, and he gave them these daily reminders. And the point of that passage was not writing it on the doorpost and having these frontals and things on your hands. It's that God is in everything your hands do, everything your eyes are seeing. It's in your home, right? So not focusing so much on the vehicle that reminds you, but it's remembering and doing it. And that is kind of the hard part. I was thinking how some may think this is silly, but all the reminders we set, if you know you're going to bed at 9:30, hey, at 9:15, we ask our phone, right? I'm not going to say, hey, the word, because everyone's phone will probably go off to set that reminder. But set a reminder to say your prayer, to read a passage to your kids. You may think that's silly, but if it helps you remember, why not take advantage of all the things that we have? And then secondly, I think starting small. There's a book I did an invitation over years ago that Dee Bowman wrote called Be Wise Small, which had a big impact on me, right? When we think about we've had trouble, we've fallen out of maybe the routine, we have trouble remembering to pray maybe or to study God's Word, whatever it may be. And in that book, he talks about there's no shame in starting small, right? If you haven't worked out in years and you think, tomorrow I'm going to get up and run 10 miles, right? You won't be running on Tuesday, right? You'll be too tired. There's no shame in starting small. Our daily Bible reading, start small and build a routine. The important part is to be mindful of it and to remember. And then finally, we respond with faithful obedience. So like I said, when we could have just skipped those few verses in the middle, very easily God could have just said, because I said so, commanded. You notice, though, obedience should be the response to redemption, right? We should want to obey him because he has delivered us, because he is faithful. And in here, when you ask, your kids are to say, why obey, right? At the end here, he says it's for our good always. Same is true for us today, that God is commanding us. He protects us. His commands protect us and preserve us and prepare us, same as it did for them. And keeping in mind, too, that God's laws were never designed to burden his people, right? God wants that all men everywhere should be saved. Jesus very famously said in John 14:15 that if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And in 1 John 5:3, John writes, his commandments are not burdensome, right? We know these are things that are doable. They're not always easy. For each individual person, there are things that may be more difficult than others, but you can do it. The faith that we have should remember, it should trust, and it should obey. He brought us out in order that he might bring us in. You know, Israel still had a wilderness to cross, and so do we, right? There's going to be trials, there's going to be temptations, there's going to be disappointments, but what I think helps me most of all is keeping in mind that the wilderness is not the destination, right? Heaven is the destination. When we get down by all the things going on in the day-to-day, the things that bring us down, if we lose sight of the prize, it's easy to get discouraged, right? And to forget all the things God has done for us. Keep your eye on the prize. Keep your eye on heaven. Remember where God found you. Trust the God who leads you and remain faithful to him by being obedient. If you're not a Christian this morning, then it is like aimlessly wandering. There is no hope of the reward. Why not have that? If you know what you need to do, if you need to become a Christian and all you have left to do is to be baptized, we can do that this morning. If you're unsure, we can study with you. We have other people who can study with you, and we can help to get you there. If you've wandered from the faith and you want to come back, we can pray for you. We can encourage you. We can help you in any way. Whatever your desire may be, you can walk forward now as we stand and sing.